Welcome to Scout's Eye, presented by Sports Info Solutions. Here's your host, Jeff Dean.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Scout's Eye podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Cooper. I'm stepping in for Jeff Dean today, who's on vacation. He's traveling the world. So I'm here joined by scouting analyst Jordan Edwards. So today we're going to discuss the article that we put out last week on the 3-year draft grades, looking back at the 2021 draft class. So before we get into some discussion, I just want to highlight a few of the rankings that came out of it and how they compare to our immediate rankings, basically following the draft in 2021. So we actually go through, we rank immediately after the draft, but we also go back 3 years later and take a look using our total points metric to basically see how these classes actually did. So this year, after 3 years, we're looking at it. The top 5 ended up being the Chiefs, the Lions, the Jags, the Dolphins, and the Bears. And then post-draft back in 2021, our top 5 actually looked like the Lions, the Dolphins, Browns, Jaguars, and Falcons. So pretty close on the Lions, the Dolphins, Jags, really close to where they ended up. We had the Chiefs actually at 21. So we were a little low on them. And I mean, honestly, we felt like they were going to be a pretty good class. But I think they exceeded expectations based on how a few of those guys played. And the Bears we had at 16 post-draft, so a little bit lower, but in that middle of the pack. And then on the other side, Browns we had at number 3, they ended up at 22, so they fell off a little bit, and the Falcons ended up going down to 14. So looking back, I did take a quick look at the consensus grades from a bunch of the top outlets, the media members, and for 2021, we're actually pretty close. We were closer to than the consensus to the actual ranking of where these teams ended up 16 times, and consensus was actually closer 16 times as well. So it was a dead even split there. So I'd say we're right in step basically with many of the other outlets. And given the way that we do our rankings and our process of grading, definitely, is good to know. So it's definitely something that we like to look at there. So now, hop into a little bit of a discussion here. Jordan, I want to toss it over to you. Get your take on the draft class as a whole and kind of what you thought of this group.
Yeah, I mean, the entire draft class, it's a pretty fun group, especially in the first round. Obviously, there's going to be emphasis every year on the first round. A couple of notes here, even just excluding total points is what we look at. Typically, you're looking for the guys that are making Pro Bowls early, guys that are making All-Pros early. 5 of the 14 players in this draft class that made a Pro Bowl were not in the first round. So 9 of the 14 that did make it to that clip are in the first round. And then also 5 players who were all pro, only 2 of them were not in the first round. So it's very, very, important to be able to hit on these first round picks, because if you're not, guys that are going to be exceeding their expectation lower in the draft, it's definitely going to be a lot harder than it seems. So a couple other things, just of note. The top 2 off-ball linebackers in this draft are actually full-time edges now. So I think that's interesting. With obviously Michael Parsons is going to completely reset the defensive market when it comes to contracts here, whether it be this offseason or within the next calendar year. And then Zayvon Collins was another guy who played more off-ball early in his career than even Parsons did, but now has kind of moved down to being a full-time edge player. And then the quarterbacks. Obviously, the quarterbacks are going to take a lot of precedence each year with this, and we just saw 6 go in the top 12 this past season, in this past draft. This one was kind of similar to that. They had 5 go in the top 15, and outside of Trevor Lawrence, who by far and away is still probably the best prospect in this class outside of, guys like Parsons, guys like Patrick Surtain and Sewell. Just with it being a quarterback, he's still probably going to hold that number 1 spot if you were to redraft it in that case. But the other 4 quarterbacks, all of them are on new teams. Trey Lance is in Dallas. Mac Jones is in Jacksonville, who's back. Trevor Lawrence now. Zach Wilson is now in Denver. And so, I mean, it's really interesting to see. And Justin Fields is in Pittsburgh now, too. So really interesting to see how all that plays out. Are all those guys going to be backups this year? Does Trey Lance take over for Dak if Dak moves on? Does Justin Fields beat out Russell Wilson for this year in the court in Pittsburgh. So I think those are really the main things. Is outside of that quarterback group, the top 10 to 15 picks, they've all pretty much hit, with the exception of one or two that are still kind of getting to where they should be. But they've had strong seasons so far in their first few years in their career.
Yeah, I think the quarterback's very interesting considering this quarterback class has been talked about for the last year, really, especially since, a lot of these guys, like you said, outside of Trevor Lawrence, everybody else is gone. They're either out of the league, they're traded, they're released. So I think this coming year, it'll be interesting to see what Fields does behind Wilson, and if maybe he gets on the field as an extra guy. I know there's some sort of joking talk of him maybe even returning kicks, which, we'll see how that goes. Like you said, Zach Wilson now in Denver. Does he end up seeing the field at all? Probably at some point, a little bit. But yeah, the quarterback class, and when we look at it by total points obviously is going to give a very favorable amount of points to the quarterback position because of the just the value that position brings. You look at Trevor Lawrence; he's number one in total points in the class. Justin Fields tied for third, and then you can consider Mac Jones; he's tied for sixth, and Zach Wilson's actually in the top 15 as well. So look at those guys. Doesn't necessarily mean they've been great. You look at Trevor Lawrence, 232 total points, probably like middle of the pack if you look at him like throughout the entire league. So obviously as you go down, 111 for Mac Jones is more, bottom half and not ideal. But if you look at the class as a total, not terrible, above average in terms of what the class brought. But as we just said, this class was not very good in terms of the quarterback position outside of Lawrence. So very interesting there. And then I know you touched on a couple of these guys, the cornerback position. Patrick Surtain, dominant. If you take Lawrence out, Surtain basically ran away from the rest of the group in terms of total points. Paulson Adebo has been really good down in New Orleans, and then Tyson Campbell in Jacksonville. So you look at Jacksonville, they got Lawrence and Campbell, basically two of the top 5 or 6 guys in the class in terms of total points. So very interesting there. And I know you touched on Parsons. He's been a dominant. Like, we thought he had some edge rush ability, 3 years ago, but I don't think we thought that he was going to be this type of player.
No, for sure not. Yeah, definitely. He was such a tough evaluation because he was playing as an all linebacker, did some rush stuff, and then the COVID season hits and he opts out of the season. So there's no third year of tape on him, so he was still kind of going off some spot duty here and there, at Penn State. And so, yeah, this cycle, I think, especially with the quarterbacks, it shows like how much that COVID season really kind of threw things off with some of the evaluations and everything. So, but yeah, guys like, Parsons, Surtain, those are blue chip players, and Sewell, blue chip player. All these guys are all hits. And so, yeah, top of his draft class is really good. And then you start to get to the bottom of the first round, then it starts to get a little shaky with some picks like, Kadarius Toney's in there. A few other guys that even Zayvon Collins, who we talked about, some guys that you maybe were, high level prospects, coming out. Caleb Farley was an intriguing player who really hasn't played all that much in his time in the NFL. And he was a guy that people thought that he was better than Surtain and even J.C. Horn at the cornerback position. Yeah, but the cornerback position overall, I think heading into this draft cycle was one of the strengths, and it's shown to be that way just based off the play of these guys, even if the order of them is kind of all out of whack.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, interesting to see. And one of the things, we'll talk about it in a little bit in terms of like, grading draft classes right after the draft or grading down the road. After 3 years, these teams have to try to figure out 5th year options for the first round here. So it's always interesting to see, like, if you're going to give it 3 years, you have to really decide that at that point if you want to invest in these guys, because these 5th year options aren't cheap. You look at some of these positions, you're looking at almost $20 million just for that year. If they're not giving you elite level production, you're better off replenishing throughout the draft or getting someone in free agency, which you can tell. I'd say about half of the 5th year options declined. And there was a few guys that were really not above average in terms of the position at the in this draft class. Obviously, those guys were all declined, but yeah, like you said, interesting guys like Farley at the cornerback position where. I was the one who watched him. I thought he really had a lot of ability, but the big question around him was the injuries. And I think that's really hurt him a little bit. And another one of the guys that, ended up probably going higher than, I think but I think he went about where people thought. But I don't think people thought he was going to be as good as, going into the league was Alex Leatherwood. Obviously, he's the one guy that has been released for years. And I know we had him at, pretty low on our list. I don't think we had him super high. I think we had a 6.5 grade on him, which, we thought he'd be a starter, but nothing, great. And you could tell what he did in with the Raiders, just really struggled and, really struggled to even stay in the league, beyond, Oakland/Vegas at that point. So, yeah, definitely an interesting first round class to look at overall. So, just want to move on to what sort of teams you thought maybe had a really strong draft class, or maybe there were some question marks in there, but something intriguing in terms of a couple of these teams.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this before in the last episode when we were talking about the classes that we liked. You're really trying to get probably 3 to 4 starters in a class, depending on how many picks you do have. But you're trying to get 3 to 4 starters, whether that be solid level, low end starter, or high level starters in a class. And so I think obviously I'll talk about the first one with the Chiefs. They were a team, didn't have a lot of picks, but they hit on a higher percentage of them. Nick Bolton, they get Creed Humphrey. Those two as their first 2 picks in the draft. Nick Bolton has become their one of their leaders on their defense. They kind of cycle in throughout the linebacker position with some other guys based on personnel, but he's somebody that pretty much stays in the entire game. Creed Humphrey, one of the best centers in the league now. And then Noah Gray is a reliable tight end to kind of pair along with Travis Kelce. He's a little bit more valuable in the run game. They can line him up at fullback. They can line him in line, off the ball, all that kind of stuff. And then Trey Smith is somebody who was another polarizing player back in the cycle, who was a massive recruit out of high school, high-level player at Tennessee, but he had some medical concerns. The Chiefs are like, all right, we'll take the gamble on him in the 6th round, and he's one of the top 20 players, top 15 players in this class, whether it be total points or just the overall perception of him. I mean, he's going to get a massive payday, whether it be from the Chiefs or somebody else down the line. And so they've hit on, 2 of our, I believe it was 2 of the top 20 or top 20, 25 offensive linemen in our total points. Just in the total ranks, there were 4 of them, and the Chiefs have 2, and they're both on the inside of their line. So they're still trying to work out the tackles, but they fortified the middle of that offensive line with 2 guys, and they're only still relatively young. And so they've got a high floor, and they've already hit a lot of their ceilings too. So these are really good players there. And then, I mean, I'll let you talk about the Lions, and we can talk about that. But I mean, the other 2 teams, the Florida teams, the Jaguars and the Dolphins, they got 4 starters in each of those as well. Obviously, Trevor for the Jags. ETN, they followed up with the first pick of the 2nd round. Tyson Campbell, he's been one of the better corners in the league so far in his career. Walker Little is somebody that they've used in a rotation with Cam Robinson, and when they lost Jawan Taylor, he's kind of played a couple of different spots, but they're hoping to get him solidified. And then Andre Cisco's been a good safety for them on the back end as well. And then the Dolphins, they get Jalen Waddle in that draft. They also get Jalen Phillips in the first round too. Obviously, coming off of his injury, he was a guy that was playing really, really well. And then Javon Holland, who's been probably one of the top 5 safeties in the last few years, even considering him back to rookie. So they have 3 high level starters in there. And then also Liam Eichenberg is somebody who took over the center spot this year. We had him graded as a left tackle, but he's somebody that's been moved around the offensive line. He's played okay. He'll probably get, he's probably going to get replaced this year. But I think he's still somebody that you can rely on in certain places along the offensive line. So the teams that are at the highest of here, they did what they were supposed to do. They got 3 to 4 starters out of here. And it just, those top two teams, the Chiefs and the Lions, are for sure going to be the two teams because they hit on multiple blue chip players, for their rosters.
Yeah, I'll get into the Lions in just a second, but just to give a little background on kind of how I go about ranking these guys, 3 years later. So, obviously, whenever we grade, leading into each draft, we have, a role-based grading. We're looking at guys who are like, 6'5", 6'6". We're talking about a low-end starter, 6'7" to 6'9". These high-end 3-down players, and then 7-0 and above. You're looking at these, Pro Bowl type, All-Pro type players with immediate impacts. You get below that, you're looking at your versatile backups into like, just top end backups and stuff. So how we grade, immediately after is basically the culmination of talent. Like you said, you try to get starters. So if you're getting a lot of guys that are like that 6'5" and up, you're getting guys that we think are going to be starters, by year 2. So those are the guys you're looking for. That's why we rank these guys that way. And then down the road, 3 years later, basically what I'm doing is I'm taking that total points number as a whole draft class and basically dispersing it throughout however many picks you had, dividing it by that. And then I'm giving you that bump if you have, either that like above average type of player. So most of those guys are probably going to be starters. It's hard to actually, objectively say this guy's a starter with all injuries and stuff like that. So you can find that average total points number at that position for the draft class. If you're above average, basically you get a bump. So like, hey, out of my 7 picks, I had 5 above average players. I'm going to get a bump for that. So it's very much on the point of what you're trying to say. Like, it's great to go out and get, the best player in the draft. But if you missed on everybody else, that's not really going to help you that much. So you really want to go out, you want to hit on multiple draft picks because you want to bring in guys who can start at different places throughout your roster. Basically, obviously from day one, but at least within, by year 2, year 3. So looking at the Lions, as you mentioned, the Lions were number 2. We had this as our number 1 class right after the draft. You mentioned Penei Sewell. He's been a stud, on the right tackle, at the right tackle position for them. Just got a huge payday. So very great for Detroit moving forward. We had him as a 7-2. I think we had him and Trevor Lawrence basically neck and neck with each other, obviously given the bump to the quarterback. But Sewell's been great. And I said it, 3 years ago, getting a guy like that at number 7, this was the first draft class for Brad Holmes, Dan Campbell in that era in Detroit. And you can tell where this set the organization basically 3 years later, coming off of an NFC championship game. So Sewell has been amazing with that number 1 pick there. Enrique out of Washington at that D tackle position has had some injuries, basically missed his entire second season, came back, did a little bit, this last year to kind of get back in the mix. But they went and got Lee McNeil next, who's been another stud in the middle of that defensive line there. A guy who was basically coming in, this is going to be an elite run stopper at the nose position. And really the last 2 years, he's taken a huge step as a pass rusher as well.
Mm-hmm.
So he's been awesome. Probably going to get himself a payday soon. Afitu Melifonwu basically came in as a corner. They flipped him to safety, and he had a breakout, last 7 or 8 games this last year. Basically rolling him down to the edge, play him in the slot. Ended up with a few picks, a bunch of sacks coming off the edge. As kind of an extra DB coming after the quarterback there. So he's been great. We haven't even gotten to probably the best player here, and that's Amon-Ra St. Brown. So, he got another, payday along with Sewell going into this season. Those guys are locked up for another 4 or 5 years now. I think we ended up having him as like our number 11 receiver. So not as far down as he actually ended up going, but I don't think we could have thought that he was going to be that type of guy. This guy's going to come in. He's going to be a solid number 3 out of the slot. And this guy's just come in and he's been a difference maker for that offense, which has been awesome. So, those, as your top 5 picks, pretty great there. Derek Barnes, getting depth at that linebacker position, a guy who's been really good on special teams as well. They've kind of mixed him in at linebacker, come off the edge a little bit. And then Jamar Jefferson came in, played a little bit, bounced around the league a little. But overall, we talked about hitting on the majority of your players. He did that. And honestly, Onwuzurike ended up having 12 total points. The cutoff for that average was like 12.4. He gets one more total point, and the Lions, we're looking at the Lions at the number one class here.
Yeah.
So overall, Lions a really good class. And like I said, this was year one of that new era with Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell. And we'll talk about it down the road. Over the last couple of years, we've had them in the top 5 or 6 basically after each draft. And you can see it on the field. Every year they seem to be putting something out there that's improving the roster, because that roster that they took over was brutal. So they've done a really good job of transforming that roster and making it to where now it's going to be really hard to make that roster. So been fun to watch, and it really started with this class right here.
Yeah, and I mean, really talking about biggest steal of the draft is probably Amon-Ra. He is one of the 2 or 3 players that you come away with that are like super high value. There's 4 players in this draft class that have over 3,000 yards receiving. All 3 of them were top 10 picks, except for Amon-Ra St. Brown, who was in the 4th round at pick 112. So the receiver class, I think each year they've been churning out guys. Probably 3 to 4 players every single year, and so I think you can kind of bank on that pretty much every year throughout. And so Amon-Ra is one of those guys. I mean, it's just really one of the biggest value hits I think we've seen in the draft over the last 4 or 5 seasons.
Yeah, and like you said, the receiver position, there's so many receivers now. Like, we talk about it whenever we're talking about scout school, or we're just talking in general. Receivers for the most part are a dime a dozen, but it's getting to the point where now they're just so valuable, and you're getting obviously really good players in the 1st round, but you're also finding a bunch of good ones who are coming out in the 3rd, 4th, 5th round. Obviously, look at a Tank Dell or Puka Nacua this last year. These guys you can find these guys. It's definitely one thing to find the guy early that is going to make an absolute impact. Like, this is a for sure number 1 type of guy. But the good teams that are drafting, they find these guys in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round. So it's huge to be able to go through that. And receiver is one of those positions that's just you can find a lot of these guys. You're really from round 1 all the way through some undrafted guys as well.
Yeah, for sure. One other thing, I think the only other 7-0 player we haven't really talked about from here. We talked a little bit about Surtain. I'll probably talk about him a little bit later when we talk about some of our bad classes as a Panthers fan. But is Kyle Pitts, and so he was the only other player that we had so high that he was definitely a top 5 player. We would say that they would be a top 5 player over pretty much every draft class each year. And so he's somebody that obviously has dealt with some injury, had a really good rookie season. The 2nd and the 3rd season that really kind of he sputtered a little bit. So this year with a new offense, under somebody who's under the McVay, the Shanahan type of coaching tree with some really cool passing concepts, and then also being surrounded by guys like Bijan and Drake London, in those types. Maybe he's and with a more reliable quarterback in Kirk Cousins. Maybe he's somebody that can kind of take another full step to becoming that high level player. Over the next handful of seasons.
Yeah, he's a guy who's played well. It's just, I think the quarterback position's been a little bit of a revolving door and made it a little bit tough for him. And he, what you saw coming out of Florida, he has the athleticism. Like, that's translated. Everything that we thought he could do in terms of like being able to play and line up in multiple spots across the formation, being a playmaker down the field, like, he's shown all that. So I'll be interested to see, like you said, Kirk Cousins coming in, a little bit more stability at that quarterback position if it really helps him out. Let's flip it over to maybe one of the teams that you thought maybe had a tough time this year.
Yeah, so I mean, just looking at the total point score, and then just kind of going off of because a lot of the times the lowest total points there might be teams that didn't have as many picks. The Rams are at the bottom, and usually they haven't had as many picks, especially at the top of the draft. But they did this year. They did have a 9 picks overall. Still didn't have a top 50 pick. They also only had 1 pick in the top 100 itself, and they ended up spinning it on Tutu Atwell. So we talk about the receiver class. They're a team that passed on Amon-Ra St. Brown when they could have had him. But they tried to get a little fancy with what they wanted because they were in such a great spot. Getting Matthew Stafford over, they had a really good season. The next season, they did end up winning the Super Bowl. So just one of those things of how it works. But three of the teams that are in here in the bottom five, they all had 9 or more picks. The Vikings and the Panthers each had 11. So not having or having as many picks as they had, usually you get a little bit more cracks at the bat to see if you get more starters. But in reality, for both of these teams, that hasn't worked out that way. With the Vikings, just not here, so I'll get away with slamming them a little bit. Obviously, they did good with Darius Salk in the first round. He's proven to be one of the better left tackles in the league. Still pretty young as well. Second round, they draft Kellen Moore, who's already been on multiple teams already since then. And then they took a chance on Chasterat, who was somebody that I wrote up for our book. He was somebody that had a little bit of promise as a position change from QB to linebacker. Kind of athletic, kind of ran all over the place. Just the instincts and everything weren't there. He's been a more of a special teams type of guy. He's already changed teams as well. And then Wyatt Davis, who was before even this draft cycle happened, he was regarded as one of the better guard prospects coming out of Ohio State. Really hasn't done anything in the league. But then they did get Cam Bynum late in the draft too, and he's somebody that's been a pretty good starter for them. So, but we talk about maybe just two solid starters versus blue chip guys, and then all these guys that aren't contributing in a way. It's going to be tough for them to grade out well. And then the Panthers here. This was, I think, going back to that draft class. This was one. This was the year 2 of Matt Rule. In the first year of Scott Fitterer as the GM, and they had 11 picks. They were really active on the draft nights. They were trading back, trading up, and they took a lot of guys that the public perception of was really good. J.C. Horn at the time had a lot of fans claiming that he was the cornerback one, and he goes one pick before Patrick Surtain, and then that follows up with Devontae Smith and Micah Parsons, Justin Fields, even those types of guys. So it's really hard to follow that up. And it's really hard not to say that they made the wrong decision there, even if he's been a solid player when he's been healthy and on the field. But he's missed way too many games for it to even be a conversation that Patrick Surtain should have been the pick there if they were going to go with the corner. And then they followed. Terrace Marshall had a massive season. For LSU, a couple of seasons there, had a lot of touchdowns for Joe Burrow. Was a big favorite of that draft class as somebody who thought that they could play a little bit better than what their draft position might be. He hasn't really done anything at all over the last couple of years. Has put in a handful of like DMPs, especially getting offensive snaps over the last season or two. Brady Christensen has been a guy that was viewed as an athletic tackle coming out, swing tackle, didn't have the arm length, had to play guard zone, struggled there a little bit, and now he might be the backup center for the Panthers coming into this season. So another guy that they didn't hit on. And then Tommy Trimble was somebody that I think we both liked. I think you wrote him up for our draft guide that year. Has somebody that's really only been kind of a move tight end, line him up offline. They try to get him the ball deep downfield because he does have some athleticism, but just really hasn't been extremely reliable. And probably their most, outside of J.C. Horn, their most effective player coming out of this year was Chuba Hubbard as a running back, somebody that really kind of took over the position, even though they paid Miles Sanders this offseason as well. And now they have Jonathan Brooks coming in, so we'll see how his role changes again coming into this year. So this was a draft that had a lot of public perception that was really well. And then after those picks, I just named off 5 of them there. None of the picks after Chuba Hubbard, are even on the roster anymore, or even made it off the practice squad at that point. So really, really tough draft class for them in that ways. And that just kind of shows having 11 picks in a specific draft class doesn't mean that you'll walk away with even an average draft of that. It could just be pretty bad in general.
Yeah, you mentioned 2 teams there, the Vikings and the Panthers, who they drafted 2 defensive tackles that I wrote up that as 6-7 type of players, and both kind of like flop. So unfortunate there. But yeah, I think you hit it on the head in terms of it's great to have a bunch of draft capital, but if you're not hitting on a good amount of it, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And I think you said a lot of these teams who are kind of down towards the bottom, especially right after the draft. Whenever we're doing our rankings right after the draft, if you have a lot of picks, it's obviously, unless you have 5 picks in the top 100, it's going to be hard for you to have a kind of a good grade average in terms of like getting good talent across the board. So just by the law of averages, your grade is probably going to be a little lower. And I know we talked about a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned the Cardinals as having double digit picks and still having that number 10 grade, which doesn't happen a lot. Getting a lot of good talent. Obviously, we'll see where they are 3 years from now. But you're typically going to be a little bit lower. But the hope is there is 3, 4, 5 of these guys are elite level players, and then once you disperse that total points number throughout the rest of the class, it's at least going to be respectable. But yeah, you mentioned a couple of these teams that are near the bottom, and you're talking about 20 total points per player. So 11 players, like you're not even hitting the amount of that Trevor Lawrence is getting just by himself.
Right.
So you want guys that are able to come in and compete a little bit and at least bring some value to multiple spots on the roster. So yeah, definitely tough there. But that's kind of the way it goes sometimes. So yeah, so kind of the final thing I want to talk about here is we've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but basically like, talking about grading or ranking draft classes immediately after the draft versus, down the road. You talk to any media member, they're like, yep, I'm going to put my grades out right after the draft and this is what it is. And then you talk to any scout, they're like, this isn't incomplete. Like it's incomplete because these guys haven't even touched the field yet. So, you look 3, 4, even, some people want to go 5 years down the road. Like I said, we're doing 3. You have to look and figure out your 5th-year options after 3. So I think doing it after 3, there's a benefit there. You could look 4 or 5 years down the road, but at least some sort of time down the road, let your guys develop a little bit and see what they're actually doing on the field. So I wanted to kind of open it up to you and just see what your thoughts are in terms of, the grading or ranking right after the draft versus, 3 years down the road. Obviously we do both. But, get your thoughts there and kind of what you think about it.
It is tough. Just because if you are grading the draft class for that year, you're grading it based off of your own perception of what they did. Unless you're somebody that is, taking a step back and only maybe evaluating the top handful group of players. But then at that point, you don't necessarily know who those guys are that go off in those later rounds. So what are you really grading off of in general? So, there is value in it where I think necessarily giving it a grade where it's an A+ or, a B- or anything. I think really just trying to grade the process is really the biggest thing, because you can really get an idea of how a team is evaluating their own roster. If, we saw the Cowboys come into this draft and they didn't really have a starting running back, and they didn't draft a running back. They didn't let one, maybe it's just a part of their process. Then they bring, Zeke Elliott back right after the draft. So maybe it's going off of, okay, why is it that they did this? That they drafted another offensive lineman, which is something that they need. Drafted multiple offensive linemen, which is something that they need. So, so trying to figure out how they are viewing their roster, I think, is really the way to not necessarily grade, but evaluate what they did. Going at somebody like the Washington Commanders, they had a bunch of picks in this draft. I think they had the 10 or 11. They took a different player at each spot at a different position. So there's somebody that they're trying to figure out. They were another team that was active in free agency. They brought in a ton of players from all over, players that followed them from Dallas as well with Dan Quinn's defense. They're trying to figure out, okay, let's try and throw a bunch of players out here and see, okay, we're going to throw all these guys out and see who sticks, and then we'll evaluate it going into the next season. So trying to balance out the roster and figure out, okay, what are our strengths going to be? Where are we going to go in for next year and take another step in the right direction? And then you got thinking of other teams, like the Broncos. The Broncos are a team that their roster isn't really that good. However, Sean Payton's at controlling the sticks, and he's like, all right, I'm going to take my guy at quarterback. But then, you look around and see that they still have some offensive line needs. They still have some holes on defense. They do have a blue chip player in Patrick Surtain at corner. They do have some other good players on that roster, but is that, how are you going to evaluate Bo Nix to the best of his abilities if the rest of the team isn't going to be, successful in that way? And they're already in a tough division with the two-time Super Bowl champs back to back, and the rest of the division is kind of turning a new leaf, with the Chargers and the Raiders, but still, it's going to be hard for quarterbacks to go into situations that aren't going to be really benefit them, which is why somebody like the Minnesota Vikings, they're taking a quarterback that necessarily maybe have this great ceiling. Maybe he does end up just being an average to solid level starting quarterback, but they've got already a bunch of pieces in place to help elevate that quarterback's play early in his career. So I think really evaluating the process of what they're doing and the decision making that they're taking versus the specific player that they're trying to, because their system is going to be different than what we might grade on a specific for a specific player in general. So we don't get to talk to these guys either, so we don't necessarily know how they're going to fit in their cultures and in their buildings. So really grading the process and trying to evaluate what their decision making was, I think, is the correct way to go about it after the draft. But still trying to take a hold of, okay, hey, it seems like they did really good. Then we can compare it 3 years down the road once these guys are solid levels, solidly, involved in a specific plan for this team. Maybe they're not even on the roster anymore, and we get to take a step back and say, okay, who actually did a really good job versus, okay, and then did it match what we had 3 years ago? It's really all about just comparing what we've done in the past versus just trying to see if we were right, trying to make sure that we're doing the right things in our evaluation process.
Yeah, I think one of the big things you hit there is like, for me, I love going back to see what we did, 4, 5, 6 years ago. And obviously it was very different at that point. We were still in a hardback book. We're 2019 through 2021, we're in a book. And this next season, when we're talking about this next year, this will be the first year of the website. So obviously whenever you're first starting things up, there's a lot that can go on, a lot of change. And honestly, like, going from the book to the website, we're talking about, we have to get everything in by the end of January. We only have a actual amount of players and that we can actually fit in the book. So when we flip to a website, we have more players on there, and we have more guys that, obviously as we go along, more guys that we're watching that are getting drafted and going in these classes. So I feel like every year we've gotten a little bit better and honestly maybe a little bit more stricter as our grading. So you look back those first 2 or 3 years, you're seeing, we probably weren't right because, maybe our process wasn't right. We're forgetting guys like L'Jarius Sneed and, guys in this class like Brandon Stevens and stuff like that, where, when you completely miss on those guys and don't have them in the book at all, you're going to miss on the ranking right after the draft. So as things have gone along, hopefully our grading has gotten a little bit better. And hopefully, now we're starting to see, our rankings right after the draft are starting to hit a little bit more 3 years down the road. And like I said, when you're looking at the consensus, we're right there with them. And that's, after year 3. And honestly, I went back and did it for the first 2 years and it wasn't that far off either. So, it's not like we want to try to be right along with the national perception or anything. We go kind of do our own thing here and there. We grade based on, role-based grading. A lot of others are doing round-based. Whenever people put together their top 100s, they're literally talking about trying to put the top 100 players who are going to get drafted, and they're not necessarily the actual top 100 players in the league. So we're trying to go about things a little bit differently, and it's interesting to see how things compare down the road as we get down, a little further here, from each draft class. So definitely cool to see. It's great to see that things are kind of trending in the right direction. Hopefully next year is great as well. But yeah, that's our discussion for today. For Jordan, I'm Nathan Cooper. Appreciate everybody hopping on and watching us. This was Scout's Eye.